So Norway became a part of Sweden, and but we kept a very independent status, and very much thanks to Britain. Actually, if Britain had decided, just get rid of those Norwegian parliamentarians, etc., Sweden could, of course, have done it. But the Swedish king was Bernadotte, who was an ex-Napoleonic general, as some of you may know. One of Napoleon's ex-generals, or whatever you call them, didn't call the generals, marshals. And he was very afraid that if Sweden had to invade Norway and fight its way through Norway, that union would be very short. And it's probably something a lot of statesmen since then could have learned a lot about, because, well, it could have been something like Yugoslavia, where you really forced several nations, like 5 or 6 nations, Serbia, Croatia, etc., Slovenia, together and said, you are a nation. And that was after World War I. And of course, these as we now know, they didn't have that much in common. And of course, we had a big war in the 80s in the not the Baltics, the Balkans. So I think Bernadette was a pretty shrewd thing. So he figured, well, let the Norwegians keep their parliament and so on. And he thought that he was right in everything except one thing. He thought the two populations would grow closer over time, but that didn't happen. Of course, we were still Norwegians, and the Swedes were still Swedes. So so that was really the situation, and that lasted towards the end of the century. And there was a lot of minor things. So Norway became more and more interested in winning independence. And of course, as we all know, and I'm sure a lot of you know a lot about it, declared independence in 1905. Fortunately, both Norway and Sweden had very good prime ministers and reasonable men, and the Swedish king was he was very disappointed, but he didn't want the war. So it was a peaceful dissolution, and it was something a lot of places could have followed. So after 1905, we had Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and pretty much as they are today. They were all fairly democratic, and it was very peaceful, called the peaceful corner of Europe. In 1905, Norway probably also had the strongest military we had, relative seen. So and that lasted. There was a lot of pride in how we won in our independence. Everybody realized that if Norway had not had any military at all, they probably would have been difficult to declare independence. And that lasted till for a long time. And then in World War I, which Norway was not involved in directly, we were not the protagonists, but of course we were indirectly lost ships, people, they were volunteers who showed up. And we know what happened in World War I, and the fact that over 10 million young men were killed. There was not that many towns, etc. There was no bombing like in World War II. So we all know the hell on the Western Front, including the last film. But if you walked 5 or 10 miles from the border, it could be very peaceful, and people would be sitting in outside restaurants. So over in the 20s and 30s, there was this enormous anti-military feeling that grew and grew and grew. And in Norway, it was called the broken gun, the brukne gevær. And that became a movement. And the military was reduced and reduced and reduced until the mid-30s, when the guy we all know with the mustache, Hitler, came to power. And initially, I think it was, people saw it, I don't know, I've often talked with my father and grandfather about it, but they probably saw him as more as an odd person and thought it would be a temporary thing. And of course, we know it didn't. And of course, a lot of Germans thought he was crazy too. I mean, you have to remember, he never got more than 33% of the vote. And he still managed to take over the country. And then of Norway and just about every country in Europe started to rearm. And we talked a little bit about this when I was down there in October or November, I guess it was. It was a bit late. You know, we did what we could, and the same did Denmark, and Finland, of course, had become independent in 1917. Sweden had kept their military in much better shape, and was probably one of the reasons they stayed out of it, managed to stay out of it. But they wouldn't have been much of a match for Germany if Germany had decided to go take Sweden after Norway. So by the time we started rearming, it was a bit late, and yeah, there's so much to be said about World War II that we have to be careful, because otherwise we'll be sitting here till midnight. But we all know what happened, and fortunately, I think Norway's honor was saved by Oscarsborg. I think if Oscarsborg hadn't, if Oberst or Colonel Eriksen had not given the order to fire and sink Blücher and delay the German invasion force that was going towards Oslo, i.e. they would have captured the king and the government, I think Norwegian history would have been very different. And that was, of course, also the big victory during the liberation fight in 1940, or during the invasion of 1940. So, so we went from being a very anti-military society, built very much on World War I experience, but also because this was, as you all know, in the 1910s and so on, was also the big rise of communism. So there was a lot of social disturbances, and of course the communists wanted to abolish the military until they won power, like in Russia. Then, of course, they expanded the military enormously. But so also in Norway, we never had any communists in power, but of course we had more socialist governments. So they reduced the military to a very small thing. Anyway, by the end of World War II, when things went the way everybody hoped, of course, then the whole atmosphere in Norway changed 100%. So suddenly, of course, military was seen with completely different eyes. It's been a little bit, maybe not as much today as it was back then, but there's never been any big discussion in Norway about having our own military. And Norway actually uses quite a bit of money. This, on a per capita basis, we are one of the biggest spenders. As a percentage of GNP, we are not yet up to the 2%, but because the Norwegian GNP is so high, we still spend a fairly high, and you see that Norway has, for example, has many more fighter planes today than most of the smaller nation that we can compare us to, like Denmark and Holland and so on. So, and of course we have a big, long coastline, so our Navy is also fairly powerful compared to, you know, considering it's only 5 million people. It's if Pennsylvania, which has a little bit more, should do the whole thing themselves, of course, it would be difficult also. So so that created the whole. That's, to me, is what created the